Excellencies, distinguished delegates, despite harrowing stories of human suffering unfolding every day in Ukraine, I fear that the world has grown numb to this crisis. It is now over 2 years since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale armed attack on the country. 2 years of immense suffering, bloodshed, loss and grief. Countless families have been separated. More than 10,500 civilians killed, more than 20,000 injured. The actual figures are likely significantly higher. The conflict increasingly is becoming entrenched and protracted, punctuated by recurring waves of attacks as seen across the country last week. 2024 also marks 10 years of occupation by the Russian Federation in Crimea. A recent report by my office set out the range of measures inflicted upon people there since 2014. The imposition of the Russian Federation's legal and administrative systems has resulted in people in Crimea being charged and convicted, sometimes retroactively, for acts that are not crimes under Ukrainian law. Russian Federation citizenship has been broadly imposed, and Russian authorities have conscripted male residents of Crimea into the Russian armed forces, eventually forcing them to fight against their own country. Ukrainian children have been deprived of the right to receive an education in the Ukrainian language. People have been denied the right to freely to express their opinion, with the Russian Federation effectively outlawing any criticism of the war or occupation in Ukraine, or the voicing of pro-Ukrainian views. Excellencies, the violations we documented in occupied Crimea foreshadowed what we now see evolving in Ukrainian territory occupied by the Russian Federation following its full-scale armed attack. In a report published on 20 March, my office documented the human rights situation in areas that have fallen under occupation by the Russian Federation since February 2022. In the last 2 years, Russian armed forces have committed widespread violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including unlawful killings, torture, enforced disappearances, and arbitrary detention. They have targeted people perceived as posing a security threat to the occupation, a scope which has widened over time to include anyone perceived as pro-Ukrainian. The Russian Federation has shut down Ukrainian internet, mobile networks, TV and radio, with traffic rerouted through Russian networks, enabling restriction of information flow and censorship of pro-Ukrainian voices. Russian occupying authorities have quashed peaceful protests, restricted free expression, imposed strict controls over residents' movements, and pillaged homes and businesses. They have actively encouraged people to inform on one another, breeding fear and distrust between neighbors and friends. These violations have taken place in a context of generalized impunity. There has been nowhere to seek justice, nowhere to turn for an effective remedy. The cumulative effect of these actions has been to create a pervasive climate of fear, which has allowed the Russian Federation to solidify its control. Excellencies, following its illegal annexation of areas of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions in September 2022, the Russian Federation imposed its own systems of law, governance, and administration in breach of international humanitarian law that govern situations of occupation. This has profoundly impacted on people's everyday lives, covering everything from criminal justice to business and property to taxes and social services. Holding Russian citizenship is increasingly necessary to access vital health and humanitarian services, social security, and employment. People living under occupation have been forced to undertake compulsory work for the Russian occupying authorities or to serve in the occupying army. My team documented a pattern of violence, intimidation, and coercion against public workers, including local officials, police officers, prison guards, teachers, and workers at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. People in occupied territory have also been pressured to vote in Russian elections. Many policies particularly impact or even target children. The education system now uses a Russian curriculum. Children are reading textbooks with pro-Russian narratives, justifying the armed attack on their country. the Russian Federation has incorporated children in youth groups to teach them Russian-imposed views of patriotism. Culture in Ukraine is not monolithic, and as elsewhere, is characterized by a complex interplay of diverse elements, including language, ethnicity, and religion, which shape beliefs, identity, ways of life, and feeling of cultural belonging. However, the Russian Federation has adopted a series of policies which have eliminated the right of residents of occupied territory freely to choose their own cultural identity and to access and participate in their chosen cultural life. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, after Ukraine retook some of the territories the Russian Federation has occupied, most of these violations ended. However, some residents then again became victims, this time at the hands of Ukrainian authorities. Under overly broad and vague criminal definitions of collaboration, Ukrainian authorities have prosecuted and convicted local residents who did ordinary work in their local community while it was under occupation, sometimes under coercion or duress. People have been convicted for activities that an occupying power is allowed to compel people to carry out under international humanitarian law. In some cases, my office also documented torture and ill treatment, arbitrary detention, and violations of fair trial rights against individuals accused of collaboration activities. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm deeply shocked by the Russian Federation's brutal treatment, including executions of prisoners of war, as was detailed in our periodic report covering 1 December to 29 February. My office has recorded allegations of the executions of at least 32 captured Ukrainian prisoners of war in 12 separate incidents. We heard credible accounts of harsh prison conditions without enough food and warmth, which in some cases might amount to torture. Some prisoners of war had lost half their body weight during captivity. In some facilities, prisoners of war were regularly tasered by medical personnel when taken to the infirmary. Many prisoners of war described the mental anguish of not being allowed to communicate with their families for months at a time. Prisoners of war have told my staff that before visits of high-level Russian officials, torture and ill treatment would often cease and the food would be increased. It is unconscionable. The Russian Federation has the power to put a stop to the torture of prisoners of war across all facilities it controls, yet it fails to do so. In the same period, my office interviewed 44 Russian prisoners of war in Ukrainian captivity. While they did not complain about the treatment and conditions in established places of detention, several of them described instances of torture and ill treatment in transit places after they had been evacuated from the battlefield. Distinguished delegates, excellencies, the tragedy in Ukraine has gone on for far too long. I call again on the Russian Federation to cease its armed attack. The violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws by the Russian armed forces and administrative officials in occupied territory must stop at once. The occupation must come to an end. I implore the Russian Federation to take immediate action to conduct effective investigations into each allegation of execution of prisoners of war and to take steps to end their torture and ill treatment. They must provide them with sufficient food and medical care, allow them to correspond with their families, provide access to independent international monitors, and create mixed medical commissions to examine the sick and wounded. In other words, the Russian Federation must implement in full the protection set out by the Geneva Conventions. History has shown us that the legacy of occupation is painful, complex, and long-lasting. To address it, I encourage Ukraine to adopt a comprehensive approach to accountability based on broad and inclusive consultations with those who have been affected. Such an approach will require policy planning and resources. The international community can and must support Ukraine in this aspect of its recovery. Excellencies, it is time to put an end to this war and occupation and to commence healing the deep wounds and painful divisions they have caused. Thank you.